Hello, in this video, we're going to be talking to chemical cycles. So let's not waste any of your time. Let's get right to it. Now, when we're talking the cycles that we're going to be looking at, the thing we want to focus on is the exchange of materials. How the particular one, we're going to look at water and carbon and nitrogen, and we want to focus on how that particular product is moved through the ecosystem, where it's a benefit, where it's a negative, and the processes and just all the processes involved. So we'll be looking at some pretty good graphics, and we'll just be breaking them down as we go along. Okay, starting with the water cycle and some background information you can see in this diagram beside me, besides the text below. As you can see there, of all the water in the world, and of course 70% of the earth is water, as we know, and ironically that's kind of the same percentage within our body as well. But of all that water, okay, and only 2.5% of it is actually usable by us as far as fresh water, and less than 1% of that is actually accessible. You think of snow and ice at the top of a mountain, groundwater which we can't get to, whatever it may be, and of course, so a very small amount. Now that 97.5% of salt water that we can't use, obviously there are processes that you can use, desalination and stuff. Those are pretty expensive processes, but it has other uses. Obviously, we talked back in chapter 3, the properties of water, those properties of water that it has, and one of them being a energy or temperature buffering situation, or it can cause huge amounts of precipitation downwind from an area. The Great Lakes area, areas to the east of those have a lot more snowfall and rainfall than the areas to the west because of our natural weather patterns. But when we're talking water cycle, we obviously know the basics of the water cycle: evaporation, condensation, precipitation, that kind of stuff. That the water will evaporate from heat, and of course once it gets cool enough it will condense in, and that's what makes the clouds. And of course those clouds get moved by the wind patterns, and so the rain that you get wasn't necessarily created or evaporated, formed there, but it's all downwind. So, and of course our natural wind patterns here is southwest to northeast, which is why if you follow storms whatsoever, they typically can start in Oklahoma City, work their way through Joplin, through Springfield, and on up to Jeff City, kind of in that line. And occasionally a little more east, a little flatter line. You can go, somewhere in Kansas, straight across to St. Louis. But it's typically southwest to northeast for our areas. But the water cycle, we should be at this stage of the game pretty familiar with how that works. But some other outlying bits of information, the groundwater, and you can see in this model it kind of shows you the variations in amounts, and of course what it doesn't show you is a unit. It's just a made up reflective conceptual model, analytical model, but it's just the idea of evaporation over large bodies of water. And you're going to have that precipitation as well, putting right back into it. They form pretty fast at times, but then it can flow over land and rain, and more evaporation, precipitation, And of course, you got your ice and snow factors where that water is locked in a frozen state. And of course, if you get a rainfall, you can have some things like runoff that it doesn't get into the ground quick enough. There's too much water too fast. And of course, if you're ever at a mall, when you have a big storm come in, you can see that the water's just running down the parking lots, headed to the drains or wherever it may be. But just in your yard, like in our yard, we get a couple of French drains. We got some areas that are low spots, and they collect that water, and we've just put a French drain in to move that water out to our front yard. I guess the ditch area is about the best way to say it. There's a fancier word for that, but I can't come up with it right now. Oh, eutrophication. I put myself a little note to talk about that. And going back to our discussions on the productivity, the NPP, one of the things that lowers that is in swamps and marshes and things where water is shallower, you can get a series of either that's actual animals, fish, or things, but more likely plants and moss and things. You get more, or I should say, because you've got a lot of things that are using up the oxygen within the water, you can dissolve all the oxygen and run out of oxygen, and that's eutrophication. Then you get plants dying, and you get that situation. The same thing would happen if you had a fish tank, and say your pump stopped working for a day. The fish can go up and get gulps of air, but they'll have a negative impact of that. It's better to just pump the oxygen into the area. This particular diagram showcasing, I should have made it a little bit bigger, but anyway, residence time. That's a key word. That's how long water will stay stored in that area, and it could be as far as like groundwater. It didn't have to be frozen, okay, but that is a part of that. But water typically in a glacier obviously lasts centuries. 10,000 years it says there, and groundwater. I mean, if it's a body of water that is really just inaccessible or hasn't been made accessible, then it can be there for a very long time. But oceans, 4,000 years, water can be in there. Lakes and rivers, 10 years, swamps 1 to 10 years, and so on and so forth. But residence time is the phrase that you're looking for there. All right, so carbon cycle, just some background information before we look at our diagram. What we really want to talk about is the sources for carbon in the carbon cycle, and that's predominantly carbon dioxide. Whether we're exhaling it or volcanoes are exhaling it, cars, whatever, but carbon dioxide is the main aspect of the carbon cycle. And that's what the plants take in to conduct photosynthesis. They break that apart, break the water apart, and they get their C's and their H's and their O's from that to make the sugars. And of course, biomass, as we've talked about a couple of times, that's an important component in the carbon cycle. So whether it's the recycling of energy through the food chains and the food webs, or it's the breaking down of the carbon dioxide by plants, somehow everybody's after that carbon. Of course, we know carbon is the backbone for all of the organic molecules, whether it's carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, nucleic acid, whatever. Carbon is super important to all that. All right, taking a look at the carbon cycle. The idea, as I mentioned, carbon dioxide. So wherever it comes into play, If when fish in the ocean, if they die, they'll sink to the bottom, and you'll get that buildup of carbon. And of course, you've got animals down there, lobsters, whatever, eating those. But you'll have that carbon buildup, and the same with on the land. You've got the food chains, food webs going on. But it's the idea of the carbon dioxide is really and of course you get your greenhouse effect. You've got that layer of ozone layer. And as the carbon dioxide builds up, that can increase kind of that buffer. It's similar to your car in the summertime. The sunlight has enough energy to go through your windshield and heat up the inside of your car, but doesn't have enough to escape as far as wavelengths and energy. So it's trapped in there. Well, the greenhouse effect is kind of the same way with the carbon dioxide. The sunlight has enough energy to get in through it initially, but once it comes down here and bounces around, it doesn't have enough to get back out, so we can warm ourselves up theoretically. The greenhouse effect. It's the same, and it's got that name because that's what greenhouses are for. If they got the plastic or the glass where the sunlight can come in, but then it doesn't get out, so those are always warm areas, which is helpful for the plants. But it's the idea of wherever the carbon dioxide is coming from, whether it's cars, us, volcanoes, there's lots of sources. It's getting trapped in there, and of course the plants are able to break it down, which is why we don't want to lose the plants. And one more, nitrogen cycle, again, super important for living things. Plants love nitrogen. They got to have it. If you pick up any bag of fertilizer, that's usually the first letter in the chemical formula. Certainly phosphorus as well. But it's just the idea of nitrogen fixation. We've seen that with carbon fixation in the Krebs cycle, getting that carbon. No, Calvin cycle. Fixing that carbon to where it can be used. And that's simply what the phrase refers to. If you know anything about farming, there are plants that you can use in tandem in fields to keep that nitrogen levels high. Legumes, the bean plants, they're able to break down that nitrogen and put it back into the soil. So if you alternate, your typical crop with a bean crop, you'll do better, or it will do better. The soil will do better at keeping that nitrogen in there. But you can see all the examples of different sources of nitrogen. And of course, if the diagram is too small, if any of them are too small, they're also in your PowerPoint. They're in your textbook, and you can certainly Google a nitrogen cycle, carbon cycle, water cycle if you want to see them more up close for better understanding. Well, that's our video over biogeochemical cycles. That also concludes our video for this series. I know only 3. They were a little bit longer, but there wasn't enough material to have it, 8 to 10 like normal. So we just made 3 long ones. This also brings us to an end of our course as far as the video lecture materials. So again, I've had a great time presenting this to you. Hope you've enjoyed it. And until our paths cross again, we'll see you then.